Academy. On behalf of our faculty and board of directors, I'm pleased to welcome all of you here to Chelsea Academy and to Virginia's beautiful Shenandoah Valley. Before we get started today, I want to start our conference the way that we start every school day and every class here at Chelsea Academy, which is in prayer. So I want to now invite Deacon Bob Benyo, he's a member of our board of directors here at Chelsea Academy, to the stage for today's invocation.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, you tell us whenever two or more gather in your name, you are present, so we humbly ask you bestow your blessings upon our group. Additionally, we humbly ask that the Holy Spirit inspire us to humbly open our hearts and minds, listen to what is said today, and find the courage to take the gospel into the world. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
All right, thank you, Deacon. So a few remarks from me before we get to the meat of our program here today. I wanted to host this conference here this summer for a few reasons. As I've settled into the Chelsea community, I've been here only about 6 months now, I realized that we're really offering a vital solution for an increasing number of parents. We at Chelsea are a vibrant, independent K-12 Catholic school in the liberal arts tradition. We seek to form leading citizens, confident men and women who are capable of making positive contributions to their families, places of work, and communities. Now, I hope you'll agree with me that that's a very worthy mission, but I think that mission also brings up a more fundamental question that needs to be addressed. Namely, what does it look like to be a faithful Catholic leading citizen in the America of today? I would submit to you that the answer to that question is different now than it was even 20 years ago. If you look around you, you might have realized that our country is not in great shape. Many will point to political polarization, secularization, a general coarsening of our culture as evidence of this. Perhaps maybe even a presidential assassination attempt. Now, all of these, I think, are obviously lamentable, but I would also argue that these are all symptoms of more structural issues at play in the country, issues that require different solutions and responses than we've given in the past, and which will now inform how it is that we as Catholic educators set about forming the next generation to be those leading Catholic citizens that we need. Now, I think what I mean here can be illustrated best by looking at the world that our young people, our Chelsea graduates, are inheriting. And I want to point to just a few key data points that, to me at least, really represent the problems that we need to be preparing our young people to navigate. So first, a few economic points. In 1997, that was, I think, before most of our Chelsea students, all of our Chelsea students at this point were born, which is crazy to me. 1997, the typical age at which someone bought their first home was 26. Today it's 34. Now that may have something to do with the fact that the cost to own a median price home in this country has increased between 80 to 100% over just the last 3 years. Middle class wages, meanwhile, have stagnated and costs have risen, so that the essentials of housing, healthcare, transportation, and education that would have cost a typical earner 30 weeks of income in 1985 now consume more than an entire year's income. So long gone are the days when most all young men could reasonably aspire to support a family on one single income. And we're seeing the spillover effect of this in the social realm as well. Nowadays, marriage and fertility rates have fallen to the point that more 30-year-olds are living at home with their parents than are themselves married with their own kids. The church has not been immune from this collapse of marriage. Between 1969 and 2022, the number of Catholic marriages in this country declined by 71%. And that's even as our population and our Catholic population has greatly increased. And with fewer marriages comes fewer babies. It should be no surprise then that in 2021, the U.S. birth rate hit the lowest level ever, 1.64 births per woman. That's well below the replacement rate. The only thing staving off our population decline is unchecked immigration, but that brings its own issues of cultural alienation and downward wage pressure that is going to disproportionately affect young Americans. And that's to say nothing of a broader culture that is not only ambivalent towards America's Christian heritage, but openly hostile to it. So amidst this backdrop, I think it's tempting to simply exhort young Americans to work harder, to be more virtuous. But while those are certainly good messages to impart to our younger generations, we certainly do that here at Chelsea, I think they're in many ways insufficient, relics of a different and simpler time, when America's Christian heritage still very much informed public life. Now, certainly we can see this Christian heritage very clearly in the middle of the last century, a long time ago, when we still had blue laws restricting commerce on Sundays and prayer in public schools. But I think that we could even see vestiges of this Christian heritage even less than 2 decades ago. Think back to those halcyon days of 2008, when even President Barack Obama still affirmed what marriage is and always has been. And the voters of California, of all places, agreed with him. Or even more recently, when praying before a high school football game wouldn't even raise an eyebrow, let alone land you defending your right to do so in front of the Supreme Court. That was the America that I, and I assume most in this room, grew up in. It was one that was normal, where normal people with normal aspirations for their lives and for that of their kids, things like a stable job and a stable family, could reasonably expect to achieve those things. It was one where you might even be able to send your daughter to a public school without fear that she'd come home one day and declare that she's a boy. That's the America that I want my kids to grow up in. It's slipping away fast if it still exists at all. So what are parents and educators to do about that? Amidst this backdrop, how should we prepare our kids to joyfully live the truth and reclaim this cultural inheritance? Now, we'll certainly discuss that at length today. But I think that the first thing that we need to do, especially as those working in Catholic education, is to consistently evaluate whether we're up to the challenges of this particular moment. In other words, whether we grasp what we're up against in the public life of our country, that's the statesmanship part of our conference today, and can then create and sustain the educational institutions capable of forming Catholic leaders within this culture. Now, I think that we at Chelsea Academy are uniquely situated to do just that. We take our name from the home of our patron, St. Thomas More. More, of course, was a true statesman, navigating the different but still very real challenges of his own time in 16th century England. And I think that More has much to teach us about how we should navigate a public square that seems opposed to our faith and how to serve God and country in that order. Now, I know many of our speakers here today know far more about St. Thomas More's life and work than I do, and about many more topics at the nexus of Catholic statesmanship and education. So I want to wrap it there, but before we do and head to our first plenary session, a few housekeeping items and notes on what we're doing here at Chelsea Academy. First, I want to thank all of you for joining us here today. I especially want to thank all the volunteers who made today possible. We have an incredibly supportive community of parents and students here at Chelsea. It's so important to our school's success, and we couldn't have put this conference on without those Chelsea parents and students. And I also want to encourage you all to join us in this important work. The first and most important way that you can do that is to pray for our school, for our students, faculty, and families, that we may stay faithful and succeed in this awesome task of forming the next generation. But we also have material needs, and we rely on the generosity of our community and benefactors to continue to serve our students. There's a couple ways that you can join us in these efforts here today. The first is by buying the books of the speakers that you'll hear from shortly. Our speakers have generously offered their books to us at cost or even donated them outright, which means that all the proceeds of the book sales today support Chelsea Academy. And I believe if you ask our speakers nice enough, they may even sign them for you. Now, the second way to support what we're doing here at Chelsea Academy is to give to the Chelsea Fund. The Chelsea Fund is a new initiative which serves as the first place to look when supporting a vibrant Catholic education here in the Shenandoah Valley. It helps fill that critical gap between tuition revenue and expenses, and it supports everything from our exceptional faculty to financial aid, curriculum development, extracurriculars, and more. You'll find more information about the Chelsea Fund on each table and at the registration table. This is somewhat of a sneak peek of what we're doing with the Chelsea Fund. We're planning to fully launch this initiative in earnest as we embark on the new school year in August. And we have some ambitious goals. We're seeking to raise $400,000 over the course of the 2024-25 school year. But I am pleased to share with you all gathered here that due to a number of generous lead pledges, we're already halfway to our goal. So please join us. Every gift really does make a difference, no matter the size. So anyways, thank you all for joining us. I hope that you enjoy the day, you enjoy the conversation, both from here on the stage and at your tables, and stay connected to the educational community that we're building here at Chelsea Academy. I look forward to the conversations ahead, and I would like to now invite our first panelist to join me on the stage. and I'll introduce our speakers. So have our first panelists come up to the stage now, please. Well, we really do have some excellent experts here to discuss our first topic, Catholic statesmanship in the 21st century. I'm going to mention briefly their bios before I hand it over to our first speaker, the Honorable Ken Cuccinelli. Ken Cuccinelli served as Attorney General of Virginia from 2010 to 2014. He was the Republican nominee for governor of this Commonwealth in 2013, and he served in the Trump administration as Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security and Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. He's currently a Senior Fellow for Homeland Security and Immigration at the Center for Renewing America. I want to run through the rest of our speakers as well, because they'll just come right up after each other. Next to Ken Cuccinelli is Chad Pecknold. He is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at the Catholic University of America. Pecknold has authored or edited 5 books, each relating to the thought of St. Augustine, to modern philosophical and theological reasoning. One of them is out there for purchase in the lobby. He is a frequent contributor to debates in the public square and is co-founder and editor of the excellent popular Substack, The Post-Liberal Order. Next to Dr. Pecknold is Tim Carney. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, senior columnist at the Washington Examiner, and the author of 4 books, most recently 2 excellent bestsellers, Alienated America and Family Unfriendly, which is also for sale in the foyer. He's written in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, The American Conservative, and many other newspapers and magazines. Last but certainly not least is Dr. Matt Mehan. He is Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Government at Hillsdale College's Graduate School of Government in Washington, D.C. It's a mouthful of a title you got there.
Inverse proportion to its importance.
That's right. His work centers on the thought of St. Thomas More, so he's a very fitting participant here at Chelsea Academy, and the education of leading citizens. Dr. Mehan has consulted for national leaders and heads of state and has written for various outlets, both scholarly and popular. So with that, I want to leave it to Honorable Ken Cuccinelli to kick us off today.
Well, good morning, all. It's good to be back with Chelsea and in a building they own, which is different than the last time I was here. So maybe that's just I haven't been here recently enough, but also I love to see the progress. So it's very encouraging, and congratulations, and keep up the great work. And Doctor, you've got the most recent news. Congratulations on starting at Christendom. It's an honor to be here in your starting month. And I know that the Chelsea-Christendom relationship will continue to be a big part of both of those institutions. So, and it served them both well, so I hope it continues to grow. I'm a former Attorney General of Virginia and member of the State Senate. I love Virginia. And it seems that with our subject today, Virginia's history offers us a useful place to start. And since we're where we are, I would point out that 275 years ago in 1749, George Washington showed up in these parts and north to survey this portion of Virginia all the way up to the Ohio River, which was also part of Virginia at the time. And 6 years later, he first stood for office to the House of Burgesses to represent Frederick County, Virginia. He lost. But he did pretty well after that. Nonetheless, at that time, and forward into our American period, that being the colonial period into the founding period, and for most of the history of this country, to have a reasonable prospect of winning an office or assuming an office of responsibility, of statesmanship, one would have had to have been known to be a person of faith. That was a presumption. It wasn't a requirement. In fact, the Constitution forbids religious requirements for offices. Nonetheless, communities make decisions in how they select and elect people to lead them. And we are a republic, not a democracy, so it is run by those selected by the electors to operate. our constitutional republic. For most of our history, your fellow Americans would have expected you to be a person of faith to assume any office of significant responsibility. It's not absolutely true. I'm speaking in generalities, so there are parts of America that would have applied to more and less. But as a general matter, it was an expectation and a positive. Fast forward to the modern era, when we live today, and it is quite the opposite. Now, the terms of that would have varied. We're Catholic here. That is not what you would have found generally in Virginia in the founding period, maybe in Maryland and parts of Pennsylvania. In Northern Virginia, what's called Northern Virginia, would have been Episcopalian. In Hanover County and to the southwest, Presbyterian. In Orange and Madison, Baptist. But Christian and serious about it was the expectation. That was the expectation. Today, the institutions of America firmly align against God Himself and people of faith. And people of faith. Media, entertainment, education, government itself, including the courts. We have the best Supreme Court of any point in the lifetime of anyone in this room in terms of respect for religion, for faith, for God, and His place in our society. Nonetheless, in this last term, they heard less than 60 cases on every subject. So that Supreme Court is not who's going to decide disputes as a general matter that any of us may find ourselves in. Now, when I was running for Attorney General, that was 15 years ago, 2009. And I recall very distinctly, I can still picture the headline in my mind of the Washington Post. It was the last time I made the mistake of going to the editorial board of the Washington Post. We all make mistakes. And the headline was very simple. It's easy to remember. It was bigot. Not a lot to memorize there. And in consistent with their quality of their journalism, they connected one of my answers to question B and connected it inferentially to question A in how they addressed my position. And the subject was homosexuality and the homosexual agenda. And the basis of my answer and the foundation that I was quite explicit about was that I approached the subject from a natural law perspective. And natural law perspective for Catholics is always going to be consistent with our Catholic faith. Natural law pre-existed Christ, but it is the church in the last 2,000 years that really developed and grew the thinking surrounding what natural law is, what it means to pursue and follow natural law, where it fits in our lives and in our societies. And that was bigotry to the Washington Post. Oh well. If that's going to keep you from running for office, then better to know on the front side. I refereed basketball for 14 seasons, and I tell people that the best preparation for running for office, it was refereeing basketball, because the minute you blow the whistle, half the people are mad at you. And if you're not ready for that, then don't step onto the court. But we are a natural law country. That is what we are. And they don't have to like it, they being all the institutions I rattled off to you. But it doesn't change the reality or our history. And changing reality or redefining reality is a big part of the weapon set of those who oppose God and the implementation of natural law in our society. I'll give you an example, also from the state Senate. Planned Parenthood has their agenda just like we pro-lifers have our agenda. And one year their agenda was to redefine pregnancy to begin at the successful implantation of a fertilized egg in the uterine wall. Well, that's a few days after conception. Why is that significant to them? Because it takes things like the morning after pill out of the category of abortion and puts them in the category of birth control. That's why it was significant. So Mary Margaret Whipple, one of my favorites in the state Senate, was advocating this, and on the floor of the Senate, you do get the opportunity to debate, and I made the point that you were attempting to redefine truth. You can pass all the laws you want, but only God gets to redefine truth. You don't get to do that, Senator. So we could pass a bill that says the sky is green. It could go over to the House, they could pass it, the governor could sign it, and when you walk out that door today and look up, the sky will still be blue. You might call it green, but it won't change truth. Truth is going to be right there for you to see. And just because it's very small and inside a woman's body doesn't change the truth of what you're trying to change. She didn't take it very well. But that's okay. That's okay. Ideas have consequences. Our faith, implemented, including in our public duties, has real consequences for the world we live in. And I mentioned our history. We have a lot to point to. I'm obviously proud of Virginia, but the Declaration of Independence, the starting point for the United States of America, is the greatest natural law document that I can think of in the history of the world. In the history of the world. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, who was the least, I'll apologize to my fellow speakers after I spit all over this microphone, the least faith-focused founding father of them all. Maybe in the running with Benjamin Franklin on that point. Typically characterized as deist. And that's what he produced. That was the low end. That's a pretty good low end. Our low end looks a lot lower than that today. 4 references to God in the document, and it's not a long document. And of course, we're all familiar with the most famous line, which Dr. Martin Luther King called our national creed. I think it is a great name for it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we're endowed by our Creator, not the president, not the government, with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And all of us know that. Not so many people know the next line when we think of how this all plays out in the real world. It is for these purposes that governments are instituted among men. What purposes? To protect life, liberty, and as they phrased it, the pursuit of happiness. That's why government exists in the United States of America. That is our foundation. That is our history. And I think Martin Luther King's comparison, or use of the word creed there, is outstanding. I love the comparison to Christianity. He unabashedly brought his faith into his civil rights work. I'll come back to that in a moment. But as Catholic Christians, we know we are called to emulate Christ. Has anybody managed to pull that off yet? Show of hands. I don't see any hands. That's very good. Yet that's our goal. We have that goal set for us by God Himself, a goal we will never meet, that we know we will never meet, and yet we are permanently and always called to pursue. And that one line from the Declaration is our national creed. We have never lived up to our national creed. And yet, to this day, we are called to pursue it. We sure don't protect life. And of course, the history of slavery is the greatest example of the violation of liberty. We fixed that. It took almost 100 years and 600,000 dead, and another 100 years of civil rights efforts. Pursuit of happiness is in there because of slavery. Should have been property from Locke's second treatise on government. Couldn't really say property when half the country could own other people. So they weren't perfect either. They were a great generation, but they weren't perfect either. They couldn't solve that problem. We've never lived up to it. And yet that is what we are called to do as a nation. And individually, as citizens who take our citizenship seriously, our obligation, our moral obligation, is to push our country, our commonwealth, and our communities in that direction. When we pray, as we do all the time, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," that's what it means. That's not all of what it means, but that is part of what it means. It's what it means for the subject we're talking about today. And I mentioned Martin Luther King's Natural Law Foundation for the work he did in the Civil Rights Movement. The best place you can see this explicitly is the letter from a Birmingham jail. It's an extraordinary document. It occurred to me as I was rereading parts of it for today that so that letter was written in response to 8 white pastors who wrote a letter saying why now isn't the right time for the civil rights movement, etc. It was all the excuses. All the excuses. I sort of think we should remind people who those 8 people were. I don't want to overdo it, but there are 2 sides to these arguments. And Martin Luther King drew heavily from Thomas Aquinas, especially his treatise on law. He was quite explicit about it. Something for Catholics to be very proud of, frankly. And he did an outstanding job of it. It is well worth, and it won't take you much time, going back to read that piece of our history. If you want to see natural law in action in the modern world, and you will immediately, trust me, immediately think of your own applications. And I can guess the subject that 99% of people here would first think of. But I'll leave that for you. And you can judge my prognostication as well. It is an outstanding use of your time. And it is an outstanding follow-up to the notion of Catholic and Christian statesmanship and the role of natural law in our society. Simple concept, simple. Simply stated, the question of a just versus an unjust law. Well, Martin Luther King directly addressed it. We need to directly address it. We need to address it with candidates, with office holders, with those in positions of responsibility who are in a position to be statesmen. Talk about incorporating your faith into your work. He managed to pull it off very well. He managed to pull it off very well. And as I said, the whole idea of natural law predates Christ by hundreds of years. It's a guiding principle that's the farther, and this is my guiding principle, the farther our nation moves from a natural law foundation and a commitment to pursuing a natural law guidepost, the worse off we are. Less happy, less faith, less moral, and more self-destructive. It is a terrible and destructive cycle. And all the institutions aligned against God and the implementation of faith in the world want us to go in that direction. They want us to leave the natural law foundation put in place in this country. And our faith tells us no, that is wrong. It is the wrong direction. It is immoral. Our job is to defend and pursue natural law. Again, each of us in the station we find ourselves. And not to back down. That's one of the most important, simple messages there is. Don't give ground. The other side and all those institutions want to browbeat you into agreeing not to advance what you believe. And I would only suggest to you, then maybe you don't believe it. But that is how they attack, it is how they operate. And that's only the beginning. I recall almost 20 years ago, a guy named Eric Erickson who helped start Red State. He's an outstanding commentator on the right. And I remember he was the first person I heard from in the discussion of so-called gay marriage, which is an oxymoron, that you will be made to care. They demand today that you simply stand aside and don't impose your faith, that's how the attack is phrased, on everyone else. Tomorrow, they will demand with the force of law or violence that you affirm that their abandonment of that natural law position is right, that evil is good. Heard that anywhere before? And we are seeing that. We are absolutely seeing that. Now, I'm not suggesting an absolutist approach. We make progress where we can. The obvious example is on the life issue. You know, some states we get 15-week bans, and Florida we get a 6-week. You know, we take what we can to protect life in the legal realm and keep operating in the private realm, supporting all of the pro-life ministries that are there to help women and families through their difficult times, or as they see them as difficult times, not being on the edge of blessing. So we don't rely on government to do all of this. We're here talking about the role of statesmen, but I don't want to leave out that we have individual responsibilities ourselves in our own communities. That think globally, act locally, it is true. And one of the challenges for me is to do all this with a smiling, happy face. We are witnesses for what we believe, whatever that is. And I've had the opportunity in my political and policy life to spend a lot of time with our evangelical brothers and sisters who are frankly a lot more, they wear their faith on their sleeve more. That is not a criticism, by the way, it is an observation. Catholics, we tend to be a lot more private and close to our chest with what we believe. And there are benefits to both. There are benefits to both. But clearly for us, that witness is a critical piece of our evangelization. Because we don't go out on the street corner quite the way our evangelical brothers and sisters often do. We have our friends and allies who operate that way, but they're more in the minority in the Catholic faith. And that witness is important. It's very important. And I would note, because of our rich philosophical history in the Catholic Church, the notion of ordering our lives, private and public, consistent with natural law is a concept we're more comfortable with than they are, simply because intellectually they don't spend as much time with or on these subjects as we do, and they don't appreciate quite as much the rich history of the doctors of the church. Obviously, Martin Luther King did, but it's something to keep in mind when you're trying to bring them over to our side. I always tell them there's always more room in the pews. With our starting statistics, we're getting more room, unfortunately. We need to fill those. And as a Catholic, ordering your efforts in the public space on natural law will always keep you consistent with your faith. You will not abandon your Catholic faith if you are pursuing honestly, sincerely, and intelligently natural law and its application in the real world. I would also note that, back to my Washington Post example, I could overtly and explicitly, as I did, make the natural law case. They weren't particularly open to it, thus the headline. But it is a way to not come across, and this is a very practicalist thought, as trying to institute a theocracy, which we're accused of all the time, but in a way that is more overtly defensible in an anti-God culture. And the fact that the people we debate and argue with and cajole are effectively intellectually lazy sometimes, not always, but sometimes, and don't want to or aren't able or aren't willing to prepare for a discussion based on natural law versus however they would like to do it, usually ad hominem is my experience, provides us a path for how to conduct ourselves. It provides a straightforward witness to others. And my last comments on this front, and it's easy to think about this given that we all know we're on the underside of where the culture is right now, we need to never give up. We need to never give up. It is not our job to win. It is our job to fight. The outcome is for God. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. I'm a great admirer of Christian statesmen, Catholic statesmen, and it's an honor to be on the stage with you. I'm going to talk during my time this morning about 4 Christian statesmen and how they touch upon education in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, and then I'll just briefly touch upon what that means for us today in the 21st century. I mainly know about St. Augustine, and so I'll talk about Augustine a little bit before I talk about these 4 great Christian statesmen. And I'm going to talk about Christian statesmen in the first 1,000 years under the idea that natural law is important for ordering society, but not sufficient. So I'm going to give you an agreement with Ken Cuccinelli, but also an augmentation, I think, from the first millennium. St. Augustine also admires great Roman statesmen, by the way. He admires pagan statesmen. He admires Cicero, precisely because Cicero loves the natural law. He studies the order of things, and that's, in a sense, why we also have always studied the book of nature. We've studied the order of things because by understanding the natural rhythms of the universe, we understand something of the way in which God's laws work and how we can imitate them. Regulus he admires Cicero, he admires Cato. These are great statesmen because they pursue the virtues, because they understand that God's law is knowable by reason. Even though he also states that no one can have true virtue, by which he means genuine virtue, that virtue which won't fail, apart from the true worship of God. Augustine wants to draw our eyes in the wake of the sack of Rome in 410. He wants to draw the whole Roman world to the place of the Christian ruler, the place of the Christian hero, more than the Roman hero. The Roman hero is important, but they don't actually do what the empire needs as it's falling apart. They don't bring the kind of unity that a society needs. He's concerned with putting forward the vision that we need for the best type of ruler. He writes in The City of God, Book 5, "As for those who are endowed with true piety and who lead a good life, if they are skilled in the art of government, as Ken Cuccinelli is, then there is no happier situation for mankind that they, by God's mercy, should wield power." So Augustine is not shy of the need to wield power. He thinks power is a good thing that should be wielded by good men, that virtue is tied to power. It's God alone who gives power to someone like Julian the Apostate, who's a bad ruler, who takes Rome away from true religion, and also gives power to someone like Emperor Constantine. And I'm going to talk about Emperor Constantine now. Emperor Constantine, of course, famously sees a vision of the cross and converts to the Christian faith. And in that moment, he changes the destiny of the world. Christianity was a fairly small phenomenon in terms of numbers. When Constantine becomes a Christian and he privileges Christianity throughout the empire, guess what happens? Christianity booms. Right? The biggest and most impressive expanse of the faith happens under Constantine after years and years of persecution. On the basis of thinking about the Christian ruler, though, Augustine knows he needs, in a sense, to form the ruler, because even a Christian ruler can fall into error and sin. So he writes in the 5th book of the City of God what we have come to now call a mirror for princes, or a speculum, the medievals will call it, a mirror that you look at to see, well, what is required of a Christian statesman? And it's quite interesting. Augustine writes, when we describe certain Christian emperors, Christian statesmen, as happy, well, what are we looking for? What's the standard for being a happy Christian statesman? Is it because they reign for a long time? They hold office for a long time? No. Is it because they die a peaceful death? They don't take risks? Is it because they leave the throne to their sons? He says, no, none of that. Is it because they should subdue foreign lands, Afghanistan or Iraq? No. Is it because they had the power to forestall enemies in their own land? Insurrections, rebellions, maybe even woke rebellions within their own land? Well, no, not actually. That's not what they should do that, but that's not why we call them happy. All these and other similar rewards or consolations, Augustine writes, in this life of trouble, were also granted to pagans. No, what the Christian ruler must do is, in fact, advance the kingdom of God. That is what the Christian ruler does if he is happy. Happiness is tied, in a sense, to what I like to call the old evangelization. The old evangelization of rulers advancing the kingdom in their land. Augustine continues that the Christian ruler does not look to material goods and temporal benefits as the highest good for politics, but rather that the justice, the natural virtues to which a Christian statesman is bound, should draw people towards true worship, right religion. This is the end of happiness. We call Christian rulers happy if they rule with justice, true. If amid the voices of exalted praise and the reverent salutations of excessive humility they are not inflated with pride, but remember that they are but men. If they put their power at the service of God's majesty, then they're happy. The Christian statesman, in this sense, is an arbiter of justice, true, but also one who leads men to wisdom, who leads the society to wisdom. And this makes the Christian statesman a kind of teacher. Just like the father and the mother are teachers of the household, so are statesmen understood as teachers, as formators, as, in some sense, the way we think about educators at classical academies, in loco parentis. Those who form the children. Those who form the children for what? For wisdom and holiness. For wisdom and holiness. The speculum regum, the Mirror of Princes, has in the back of its mind the old tradition of looking to King David. And King David is a just man. He's a righteous man. He's a man of might, of defense. But he's also known as a man of wisdom, a man who writes the Psalms, a man of right worship. And this is what stands behind Augustine's Mirror of Princes. That the standard of the Christian emperor is one which is both morality, both natural law, and advancing true religion. It's a political standard, in a sense, which will come to form all of the medieval emperors as well. He doesn't place the standard far out of reach. He immediately, in Book 5, talks about Constantine and Theodosius and how they measure up to this mirror, how they measure up to the standard. Constantine is, in Augustine's view, a miracle. Constantine is a miracle of God. He is an emperor who Augustine admires for his natural gifts as a ruler, but he also admires the fact that Constantine gives no worship to demons. This is how he typically talks about paganism. Paganism isn't worship of gods, but worship of demons who puff up the gods as imaginary figures. Augustine praises God for granting to Constantine the honor of founding a city, Constantinople, but also being a kind of new father to the Roman Empire. And that this is an empire in which the demons are no longer privileged. Now, Constantine does not make Christianity, Catholic Christianity, the official religion of empire. He makes it a licit or licensed religion. But in his material practices, he begins to educate the Roman people about true religion simply by funding things. He builds basilicas, right? He begins to honor the Catholic Church. And this itself is a kind of material education of the empire. After Constantine, we have a kind of fallback position in Julian the Apostate, in which the empire turns away, but Augustine then turns hopefully to the next Christian statesman, Theodosius. Theodosius actually did make Catholic Christianity the official religion of empire. By this time, pagan practice had fallen off miserably. There wasn't a lot of strong commitment to pagan cults. Nevertheless, Theodosius did crush pagan cults. He did shut down certain pagan cults in his land, and Augustine admires this, just as he admired Constantine. But the fascinating thing about Augustine's admiration for Theodosius, the Christian statesman, is that Theodosius screws up. Theodosius screws up. Christian statesmen screw up sometimes. They make mistakes. Theodosius made a mistake. He made a mistake. He ordered the death of thousands of people unjustly. He wasn't held to the standard of natural law. He didn't hold himself to that standard. But why should Augustine admire Theodosius? He was a bad man. No, Augustine admires Theodosius as a Christian statesman because Theodosius recognizes his error. He recognizes his sin, and he goes to the cathedral in Milan, and he gets on his knees before God and begs for mercy, begs for forgiveness. And this is what Augustine admires about this next Christian statesman, that Theodosius educates the people by acknowledging what true worship should be at the center of the empire, but also acknowledges that a society is only going to flourish in justice if justice is tied to God's mercy. Justice and mercy must kiss in a society. And so Theodosius, as Christian statesman, is raised up higher even than Constantine for Augustine. He calls Theodosius a defensor fidei, a defender of the faith. If you go to the portico in St. Peter's Basilica, you will see Constantine at one end and Charlemagne at the other, and both are given this sacred title, defensor fidei. That is Augustine's standard, which he recognizes in the city of God, Book 5. Two other statesmen I want to talk about briefly and then talk about our contemporary challenge. Justinian is an emperor who comes 150 years later, and he has the unfortunate task of trying to unite what had fallen apart. The Vandals had caused damage in Rome, certainly, but the bigger challenge was internecine political disputes that tore the empire apart. And Emperor Justinian was a Christian of the East, we call it Byzantine. Byzantine is just super Roman. It's not anti-Roman. But the Byzantine tradition, sorry, that's a little liturgical joke there. Justinian thought education was important at the level of law. Okay, so both Constantine and Theodosius think educating the public matters in material terms. Justinian thinks he can reunite the eastern and western parts of the empire by revising the law code. If you go to the Supreme Court, you'll see the Justinian Code is on the bronze door. And that's because Justinian assembled hundreds of lawyers to revise the law code to, in a sense, give it more coherence. And what would give it more coherence? Christianity. Christianity, in a sense, was suffused through the Justinian Code, and this is what essentially he used, and successfully, to reunite briefly the East and the West. And so here we have, in a sense, a Christian statesman paying attention to the way in which law educates, the way in which law is a teacher, and a teacher of both morality and true religion. The fourth and final Christian statesman I want to point to is one of my favorites, Charlemagne. Now, Charlemagne is probably the most important. King Charles, as he was known amongst the Franks before he was crowned Holy Roman Empire by Pope Leo, and famously on Christmas Day in the year 800, Charlemagne does something better than Constantine, Theodosius, or Justinian. He hires Alcuin of York. Who knows Alcuin of York?
Saint Alcuin.
Saint Alcuin of York was a very funny man, a very learned man, a brilliant teacher who educated every important person who came through Northumbria while he was up in York. And then he met King Charles. He met Charlemagne before he was Charlemagne. First met him in Rome, we think. And he was a first-class educator. He was an educator. He was just a teacher. And Charlemagne saw something in Alcuin that he wanted. He'd already brought scholars. He'd captured the Italians. He'd captured the Lombards. He'd brought Italian scholars. But Alcuin had something that no other scholar had. He had humanitas and gravitas. Alcuin was brought into the Carolingian court as head of the educational program of what would become the Holy Roman Empire. Alcuin formed schools. Most importantly, he formed the school, the Carolingian court school at Aachen, where King Charles built the wonderful, still stands to today, the Saints Chapel in Aachen is one of the most beautiful Saints chapels you've ever seen, the most beautiful chapels, period. And a study of the liberal arts. Now, all of a sudden, a Christian statesman is promoting the study of the liberal arts, just as a Christian statesman might promote the study of natural law, because this is the basis for forming the kind of people to make a good society. Charlemagne wanted people who could fight. Charlemagne wanted people who could work. And Charlemagne wanted people who could pray. Most importantly, that all of those people would be people who prayed. And Charlemagne believed that in order to pray and win God's favor, you had to pray correctly. You had to worship correctly. And therefore you needed to learn grammar. You needed to learn rhetoric. You needed to learn music. My wife would insist on me saying that. And so he did. Form an expansive educational network. This is at a time in the 8th century when classical learning had almost been decimated. Bede, Venerable Bede was copying things, and he was kind of often his Institute of Advanced Studies up further north. But Alcuin, in the next generation, under Charlemagne, takes on an extraordinary educational effort on behalf of the Holy Roman Empire. That is, on behalf of a society that is Christian. Now, Charlemagne is a little bit like Theodosius in that he sometimes makes mistakes. Charlemagne wants to convert pagans, and initially he decides the best way to convert pagans is to make it a capital offense to not be Catholic. Killed, actually, thousands of people. Saxons, pagans. And it's Alcuin of York who says, no. It's very, very important that the Christian faith is one that is not coerced by faith, but we come to the Christian faith through grace, through teaching, through forming people. And so the school system was actually the way of doing that. Instead of taking an axe to the infidel's head, you took education. Education, words, persuasion. This would be our weapon for making a Christian society. And by the end of Alcuin's rule, his kind of educational rule in the Carolingian court, he died in 804. Pope Leo makes Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor 800. So Alcuin only gets to see the fruit of it for a few years. But he sees the fruit of this educational system. Every archbishop, every important scholar in the 8th century had been at some point taught by Alcuin. Alcuin was the great formator of a new kind of political society, a political society which people had a memory of, but which had fallen apart by the 8th century. That's the situation we're in today. We're in a society in which that Christian memory has fallen apart, is in disarray. But what is required of us is something like the Carolingian Renaissance. We need a Carolingian Renaissance anew to convert the new pagan, the woke pagan. We need a educational renaissance that matches Alcuin, so that at some point in our future, 200 years from now, we will be able to talk about this extraordinary point in our history in which everything changed because we made that commitment. We made that commitment to an educational renaissance for people who could have good work for their families, who could defend their families, and who could pray freely to the one true God. Now, just one brief note on this. In terms of contemporary politics, I won't mention our own electoral process right now, which is very interesting, but I'll mention Hungary's. I had a conversation with Katalin Novak, who was the president of Hungary, and with Prime Minister Viktor Orban, about the purpose of legislation. Sometimes people get critical of Hungarian legislation because it's not effective at some goal or another. Child replacement, birth rates is one of the controversial things. And Hungarians have made laws which are committed to 5% of GDP is going to be spent on family formation. And at least through 2030 and probably till 2050, they've made a commitment to spending 5% of GDP on family formation because they have 3% going to defense. And they said, well, if we're going to spend this much on defense, we should spend more on what we're defending. Right? You can't spend on defense and not spend on what the good is that Hungary is producing. And I asked, well, what do you say to critics who say that this family formation policy is, we conservatives don't like entitlements and things like that. So I had to raise the question. And he said, really the statesman, this is a very, very interesting insight about the Christian statesman, which I think maps on to these four emperors that I've talked about today. He said the statesman is not always interested in certain kind of data points being met, but a certain mentality being formed in your people. Okay, what if this 5% on family formation doesn't work to change your replacement rate? Well, what it will do, even if it doesn't work for that, is it will change the mentality of a population for generations to think that family formation is what we value. Right? That families are the fundamental goodness of our society, and that our society will be Christian. That, I think, draws very deeply on the mere prince's tradition which Augustine gives us to ask what will make the ruler happy. Getting the right tax rate, getting the right code in the law sometimes, getting the right data result in birth rates or whatever. No, actually forming a people for where Renaissance always comes from. And that is the goodness of the domestic church, the goodness of the family, the ability to raise, well, what Emile said at the beginning, to raise a family that can live and breathe freely and worship the one true God. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pecknold, and it's a pleasure to be on stage with two people who go by doctor and one who goes by honorable. I am the exception to that rule. Having none of those honorifics, I'm going to rely on, I'm blessed with being a reporter, so I get to travel this country and see what it's about, as well as study what it could be, not, as our vice president would say, what it could be unburdened by what has been, but what it could be in the light of what has been. And so I'm going to tell a couple very quick stories. A couple about Milwaukee that I just got back from last night. And, well, first, advice. It is not good to consume 90% of your calories in beer and cheese curds. This, I was warned. I did not listen to the advice, but it is true. So a couple about Milwaukee, a couple about another town in Wisconsin called Oostburg, a couple about a dreadful place called Twitter, and I think I'll probably come back to Milwaukee and here in the end. So first, it is the job of a statesman, among other things, to lay out a vision for the good life. That really needs to be said because so much of what we see American politicians doing, Americans doing, is just saying, well, the pursuit of happiness, individualism, you all get to choose your own path. And I actually really do believe that. I am a classical liberal. I do believe people have to choose. They can't be coerced at axe point. They have to choose the good path. But what we have to have from the top, the cultural heads, the statesmen, the schools, is clearly painting out that there is a good path, that there is a good life. Not just one, but an important thing that happened, I thought, and something that was missing in Milwaukee. When J.D. Vance went up there and spoke, he had an image, a couple moments that got me a little choked up. He started talking about how he joked at first. All I had was a burial plot in the mountains of Kentucky. And near the end, he came back and painted the image of his own children laying him in that ancestral burial plot. Now this, of course, got branded as a racist dog whistle on MSNBC. I'll talk more about racist dog whistles later because usually if it gets called a racist dog whistle, you're talking about something true, important, and good. But that idea of marriage and a family and grandkids and ancestry, that is a particular path in life. And it's one that's actually rejected by a significant part of our commentariat and ignored by a lot of people who are vaguely on the right. They'll say, we want you to do whatever you want, follow whatever path. Again, that's absolutely essential. But to say, here's an image of a happy man. This is part of, I'm in journalism, in the media, and I do that. But I think our leaders need to do that as well. While leaving liberty for people to choose wrong, we need to better lay out the image of the happy life. And a big part of that is not just marriage and kids. I think that's among the most important. Local community involvement and faith in God. Both of those have to be laid out as the image of the happy man and the happy woman. So what did I see in Milwaukee? Well, after getting a lot of subpar cheese curds, I decided to go to Lakefront Brewery, which is famous for having the best cheese curds in all of Wisconsin. And it does. I've been there before. I hadn't been there in about 8 years. And as I was growing up, I was starting to think about my experience with breweries now that I've moved to Northern Virginia a couple of years ago. And I realized, wait, from the outside, I did not see a rainbow flag hanging at Lakefront Brewery. I thought it was absolutely mandatory. It's funny, the things I love the most, the breweries and the coffee shops, it's absolutely mandatory that they fly a rainbow flag in the DC area. Could there be one? Sure enough, I walked in and there was one there, sort of sitting a little innocently in the corner by a cash register. And I just thought, well, what this is people who are not afraid to publicly show their faith. It's a pagan faith, but it's out there. And how many Catholics are afraid to publicly show their faith? They follow the Nancy Pelosi message. When Nancy Pelosi was trying to defend the Democrats' prosecution of Little Sisters of the Poor, she didn't like these questions. Somebody said, well, what do you believe? What are your views on contraception? What are your views on this? Do you disagree with the Pope? She wanted to shut down the questions about religion, so she said, I do my religion on Sunday. And then she noted, and other times when I go to daily mass, and I was thinking, okay, that she even thought of daily mass as good. I hope to go to daily mass at least as much as Nancy Pelosi. But I do my religion on Sunday is sadly the way a lot of Catholics live. And so a way to be publicly, forwardly Catholic without necessarily infringing on the pluralism, the liberalism that I think our system requires, is to just absolutely own it. To have it so that when you walk in, somebody says, oh, there's that Catholic lady. I grew up in Greenwich Village. I used to be an MSNBC contributor. I am part of the news media, and we hang out in these news bullpens outside of the conventions. And there will sometimes be people who will direct message me and say, okay, somebody just said, somebody was trying to make a pro-abortion argument, and they said, oh, well, you know Catholics don't really believe that the unborn child is a baby because they don't baptize unborn babies, and they don't baptize stillborn babies. And so I had a friend in the media be like, okay, I have a feeling this is a really bad argument, but I don't know. Can you explain it to me? And, I did, so I served that role. But the other is the kind of people who would just instantly say, oh, this person, this belief is bigoted. I sometimes hear them say, well, it's different because Carney's like a Catholic. But no, he's like a real Catholic. You can tell. He has 6 kids. And I heard this from some of my libertarian friends who were supporting Ken Cuccinelli for governor in 2009. Sadly, not enough of them did, but they were like, yeah, some of that conservative stuff rubs me the wrong way, but I understand it because he's a Catholic. In other words, going out there and wearing your faith on your sleeve makes it more acceptable. Maybe they can be made to care. Maybe they can be made to say, all right, there are Catholics in public life. Some of our arguments, some of our beliefs are simply not even known or even basically understood. And part of it is because we're shy about it. I mentioned another place in Oostburg. Well, I mentioned Twitter first. Too often, some of what our leaders do, and some of the good governors in this country try to stand up to the badness in public schools. And they say, you're not, and they try to craft a law that's preventing teaching of critical race theory or teaching of gender ideology. And they try to ban a particular thing. You're not allowed to talk about sexuality in the classroom. Well, one response is, the teacher saying, well, I'm just mentioning that I'm a woman married to a woman. Am I not allowed to mention that? And soon you realize the flaws, the shortcomings of this. We're trying to neuter education. We're trying to make education, and you hear it all the time from conservatives. Reading, writing, arithmetic, leave the values out of it, that's just for the home. That's a totally wrong approach. So one day on Twitter when somebody said, CRT should not be taught in public schools, critical race theory. And I said, how about we instead mandate that natural law be taught in classrooms? And a professor from Yale quote tweeted me and said, the white nationalists aren't even trying to hide it anymore. And then Nicole Hannah-Jones retweeted that, and I became famous on Twitter for a day. It was great. It shortly became clear that neither Nicole Hannah-Jones nor this Yale professor had any idea what the phrase natural law meant, much less any idea what natural law contained. Because we haven't been going out there and leading with our chin. And for all that you guys should buy our books and read our articles, political leaders will have to be the people who go out there and state something. And our political leaders, where they fell short in Milwaukee, you had one mention of the birth rate. Kristi Noem, the governor of North Dakota, South Dakota, I'm supposed to know this, South Dakota. Kristi Noem said, we have the highest birth rate in the country. And she said, because we love babies and because we make it better for families. That was the only mention. That's the only mention in any Republican convention since at least Richard Nixon of the birth rate. And Richard Nixon was worrying that it was way too high. And so that needs to be an issue. I'll disagree probably with Chad and with Orban about some of the policies that are productive and some that are counterproductive. But certainly that idea of saying this is a norm. And that suffix normative, that's now negative in the media, right? If something's heteronormative or cisnormative. I say we're a pluralistic society. We're not a Catholic country. So we need to be tolerant. We need to be open of lots of different ways of life. As Catholics, we believe there are lots of different ways of life. Again, marriage, family is sort of the normal calling, but all of my favorite priests have no children. So we know that there are multiple paths of life. So we can be normative and tolerant and accepting at the same time. Which brings me to Oostburg, which is where I'll end. Oostburg is a village in Wisconsin that I found because I was looking for the most Dutch place I could find a few elections back, reporting on the country. People of Dutch ancestry, if you live in a county that's everybody's named Vander something, you have lower high school dropouts, lower drug overdoses, bigger families, more marriage, less out of wedlock birth. So I was trying to figure out what was going on in a lot of these places. And politically, they behaved very differently. These were the places that were very resistant to Trump at first, because Trump said the American dream is dead. And they said, no, it's not. And then, of course, they voted for Trump because they're more conservative in the general election. But what was going on in these Dutch places? And I couldn't figure it out. And I went to Holland, Michigan. And finally I ended up in Oostburg. And I got there on a Sunday, and I sat down at the diner, and I realized what it was. When all the families came in from the 8:15 at the Christian Reformed Church, and then all the families from the 8:30 came into this diner from the 8:30 at the Reformed Church of America. And then there's another there's 4 in a village of 2,000, 4 Dutch Reformed churches. And so when the Dutch refugees came to America and settled they were Calvinists. When they settled in the middle America, they didn't just plant churches. They planted really tight-knit communities built with institutions secular and religious, diners, churches, public schools. And I sat down next to a guy who fixed tractors in Oostburg. And he's there at the diner, and he's got all the grease under his nails. This is later, after the church crowd clears out. And he's eating his lunch. I'm eating my cheese curds. And he says, I say, what is it? Do you have any complaints about Oostburg? He's like, no, I love it here. He's not very religious. He says, I send my kids to public school, and I'll tell you one complaint I had just a few months ago. I showed up at the Christmas concert, and I was 5 minutes late. And you can imagine this guy showing up. He probably showered. He's trying to look nice, and he's still got that grease under his nails. And he looks around, and there's no seats. Nowhere to sit at the Christmas concert in the public high school gym. And he looks over, and in the back row is his neighbor who sends his kids to the Christian school. And they're taking up like 8 seats. Dave, why are you taking up my seats at the Christmas concert? And Dave says, well, we had to see our kids. He meant our kids are the kids of Oostburg. There's that incredibly tight-knit idea. So this ties in a couple things. I think it's their faith that makes that it's in the air. And this is why I say pregnancy is contagious, because it definitely spreads locally. As you know, if you are in a place like this, or St. John's, or the Heights, or Oakcrest, it seems to be contagious. But the faith and the values spread in the air. And the idea that we have a duty to children definitely spreads in the air. But if it's something that's contagious like that happens, it's going to fundamentally have to be local. So I'm going to leave that on the table for my last point, that the solidarity that we need is always paired with a subsidiarity. That the individual is overemphasized in this society, but the answer to that is not the nation, but the little platoon, the community, the parish, the small school like Siena Academy. That is what the statesman, and it's a challenge at the national level, because you can't solve most of these problems. But you have to lay out the vision of the good life and give the charge to the local leaders. And I don't just mean the local government leaders, I mean the church leaders, everybody, to say, give us more kids, have more families, we'll all support you. This is a path to the good life. That's where the change is going to be made. The statesman job at the upper level is to lay out the image of the good life, give the charge to the lower life, because that's where we'll get not just resisting the pagans, but one last note. I just bought a house in Falls Church after 15 years of living in Maryland. And the backyard was totally overgrown with kudzu, an invasive vine brought in by Franklin Roosevelt. But anyway, we killed the kudzu, and I say, how do I keep it out? And the gardener said, if you want to keep out the invasive vines, you have to plant good grass. If we want to keep out the pagan faiths, we have to plant the true faith. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you, Emile. Thank you, John. And thank you especially to King Cuccinelli, because he's actually in the practice of Catholic statesmanship, which is always a kind of startling compare with the theory. And it's worth celebrating that service. And I would actually like to give a round of applause, partly because it helps my talk, but also because it's due. So, now, why was that useful to me and not just Ken? We don't have a lot of Catholic statesmen. We're not sending our best, people. It's just true. I work in Washington, D.C., and I'm teaching in the master's program, which we founded a few years ago. And it is some of the most publicly spirited and wonderful young people. It gives you great hope to see these people serving. But there's A, not a lot of them, and B, among their principals, there's even fewer. And among those who mean well, most of them are hideously miseducated and unprepared to do what needs to be done, right? And since this is an Educating for Virtue in the 21st Century conference, I kind of wanted to bring it back to what are the things that we should be doing as mothers and fathers, as teachers and school administrators to change that. Because for one, I think actually there's a number of people who don't think we ought. They think that that's actually not one of their jobs and that that's activism or evil or some kind of violation of church and state or whatever it is. And I think we got to get over that hump first. There's a certain kind of quietism that can create a worry over this. But in one sense, to allay the worry and think about it in this way, we're talking about normativity and the Carolingian Renaissance. We need a normative conquest of the Anglo-Saxon world. We need to look at, I think, a series of virtues that we need to put in the forefront of young people's minds. And then we need to think about the way in which you do that is to put them, or put before them examples of this, which is why I really like Chad's talk of here are some people, and Ken was mentioning George Washington, among others, and Jefferson. And yes, the people of Oostburg, and I think we got to focus on local leadership too, but we need to give them models because that's the fundamental way people change, is they see a model. Personally, Thomas More, I was tapped on the shoulder at 21 by Jerry Wegemer, a wonderful professor. I've spoken about him before here. Headmaster John Dijak knows him well. And he took me to England to be his TA and study Thomas More. And I taught him for years there. And getting close to the person of Thomas More has fundamentally reoriented my entire life. There's no doubt about that. It's one of the 3 or 4 most transformative people outside my parents and my wife that I can point to. And what I want to do is basically kind of give you a few virtues that I think we need to focus on. But the first one, first and foremost, is a theological virtue, rightly understood, and that's hope. We don't foster the virtue of hope a lot. I think there was a certain millenarianism, a certain, that's the wrong word, millennialism, whichever. I'll let Chad sort that out later. Apocalypticism, yeah, that's right. This sort of, Y2K, 2022, like whatever. This sort of, the end of the world is coming. Well, I had a friend of mine say that. I was like, it's looking pretty apocalyptic. I said, don't be slothful, because that's just an excuse to not clean this mess up, right? We need to have hope, not just in heaven, right? We do, capital H, hope. But we also have to have hope that we can actually better society here for the proto-evangelium. That is to say, right, you hear this, I hear this amongst Catholics all the time. No, I don't have to be hopeful about America, right? I have hope in heaven. It's like, no, that's wrong. That's actually not correct. You have hope in heaven, and as a result, you have hope in a provident God who loves you and who wants more souls from this people for his kingdom. So that means you have a reasonable lowercase h hope that he will back your play to better society, right? Theodosius made a horrible mistake and started axing people and murdering everybody. And it turns out the pagans were stronger than the Catholics knew, and they raised an army in Spain and Cisalpine Gaul and came, and it was like 10-to-1 odds. This enormous army came and marched down from the Alps to destroy the Catholics and reinstitute paganism, right? And at the Battle of Frigidus, they lined up on the high ground against the mountains, and the Catholics just sort of went out like to the Black Gates like some pitiful Tolkien token army to get slaughtered for Christ. And a wind blew for 3 days, and literally ripped the shields of the Roman legions of the pagans off. They tried to throw spears and slings. They turned back and killed their own men. And the Christians sort of looked around and just tossed a bunch of spears and killed them all. And the Vestal Virgins burned the last vestiges of pagan iconography. The Pontifex Maximus fled in despair. I think he committed suicide in Greece. Whatever. It was the final rout of paganism at the darkest moment for Christianity. Why? Because of brilliant statesmanship? No. Because of the provident care of our God, right? The famous fog in New York that saved the entire Continental Army of George Washington, there was never fog there, ever at that time. It just was this weird one-off. The providential rains that saved them as they retreated in New Jersey, right? The more you think about the way political and social action operates, the more you study history, the more you actually come to believe in providence, right? That God shapes the nations, but he doesn't just shape them meanly. He shapes them to benefit us so that we can do good in the world. So we should have more hope that when we do civic work, when we do try to do the kind of work we're discussing here of Catholic Christian statesmanship in the 21st century, that we actually have someone backing our play, and he's extremely powerful. And that should be very hopeful and a happy thing. That's one. Two, you have to have a double vision. You have to have a certain prudence, a witty double vision. And I'll challenge everybody on the stage just a little in the direct method as always the correct one. That is to say, sometimes wearing it on your sleeves is correct. Sometimes straight at you natural law talk is correct. But, as Shakespeare said, have more than thou showest, speak less than thou knowest. Or as the famous and greatest poet in America ever said, Emily Dickinson, tell all the truth but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Right? That is to say, if we are going to reconvert the world and reorient everyone back to the good, they're going to have to trust us, they're going to have to love us, and we're going to have to be very sensitive to maintaining those social bonds with them, which is the first virtue of justice, is to maintain the charitable bonds with others. So it's not always wear it on your sleeve, right? Sometimes it's let's have a common discussion about some basic good like a job, right? Let's get serious about making sure someone gets health care, et cetera, et cetera. All of those kinds of basic activities, right? But building a friendship, and then in that friendship, right, they go, oh, who is this? What's driving this? Oh, this person loves me. Where does that love come from, right? Good, prudent rhetoric is create the desire to know. So if we love them, they will come to desire and understand where that love comes from. And obviously, see how they love one another, right? That's something I think we all need to be much more careful about, generally speaking, as Catholics, right? In public life too, right? Is see how they love one another, right? That's going to be one of the number one ways they actually think about what we're doing. So a double vision is actually a line from Thomas More's political poems, that the wise man has the double vision to see both the afterlife and this life sort of in a kind of almost a kind of double field, that there's these proximate ends that I have to serve, and then there are these final ends. There's a lot more we can say in the Q&A, but I know we're quite pressed for time, so I'm trying to move quickly. The other thing, the other virtue that I think, besides that sort of general hope and that prudence of double vision, the other one is magnanimity. We need to train not only a certain kind of rightly understood hope and prudence and wit, which comes through the liberal arts and poetic study and rhetorical study, by the way, but we also need to train magnanimity. We need to teach them about great-souledness. Well, what is great-souledness, right? It's the willingness to sacrifice, and a number of eloquent things have already been said, the willingness to sacrifice for the highest goods. Now, the highest good is heaven, the highest good is God, right? But the second highest good is the city, right? Is our political community, is the American Republic. And those are, in a certain sense, if you have the double vision, and the hope that I was just discussing, if you have people who are going to actually sacrifice and suffer in order to build up that human community, knowing that that is actually the proto-evangelical means to prepare the good soil for more seed for that Carolingian Renaissance or that normative conquest, or in a certain sense, the re-Christianization of not only this country. I think we're thinking too small. Who's going to do China? Who is going to convert China? Us. That's a big goal, reach goal. Dreaming your dreams will fall short. You should fight for those kinds of visions of what are we going to do, right? But magnanimity means sacrifice and suffering. That means maybe not having a stable home for a number of years. Maybe just delaying the sort of white picket fence because there are some greater goods that need to be achieved, right? That means, yes, having a bunch of kids and sacrificing and suffering that because, yes, it's souls for heaven, but it's also citizens for the country. I think you're going to fail every time if you only do, the Romans failed hideously, everyone has, if you just say, we need more babies for Rome, like that's not going to work, right? That it's part of it. It's a combo. The two are actually very strong. We need more Americans and we need more souls for heaven, right? That grace and nature working together, right? But magnanimity means that you set up for someone, you know what? There's lots of good goals, and you should weigh your talents and decide where the apex of your sort of, where you're going to serve, what the height of your service could be. But if you see someone with the profound and serious talent, right, who could actually be of great service to the country, you should have hope enough to encourage that, knowing that if they're called, they'll actually be called to the priesthood or whatever higher calling. God will take care of that. Providence is on your side, right? But you want to first train that human virtue of magnanimity, of great service. And by the way, the great statesman, Alcuin is one of my favorites, by the way, and he is why you have Thomas Aquinas, right? 100%, because he wrote that hilarious letter for Charlemagne to all the, Jefferson was right, there was a lot of monkish ignorance. In fact, Alcuin's like, you monks can't write, and I need good emails back to the empire's capital, right? But he restored education, right? We need to set up, right, an educative course which is sacrificial and difficult for young people, right? They have to train themselves in the liberal arts, and hard and well, right? And how do you get a kid to study Latin when they're in 9th grade? Their brain is mush, I mean the boys especially, but the brain is mush, right? How do you get them to do that? You have to tie it to some greater human goals, and tie it to charity and friendship and service, and yes, glory, rightly understood as for God, but through you. We just honored Ken. Ken, I know, is a good man and he could take it, right? That is to say, the applause could corrupt his soul, right? Honor and vanity. But he refers it to God, right? But we have to be willing to deal with that danger, right? That requires magnanimity. No, I don't want to do public life, that's dangerous. How do you get people who are willing to do that? We have to rethink a lot of how we talk about magnanimity, rhetoric, prudence, and hope in a kind of double-visioned way, a much wittier way that suits our wonderful, hopefully much more Christian republic as time goes forward. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. That was fantastic. Just one note for all the guys on the stage. If you hold the button on your mic, that will turn it on. If you push it, that will pause it. So when we get into our Q&A here, hopefully you'll be able to hear our panelists. I want to hear from all of you. We don't have too much time for questions here, unfortunately, before we break for lunch. So we will have one of our excellent Chelsea students walking around with a mic if you have a question. I guess if I can indulge myself just to start the conversation here, we heard some great thoughts on the statesmanship portion. As we get into the afternoon, we're going to kind of transition to the education side. And I think, obviously, being here at Chelsea Academy, being a school, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask our panel how this specifically relates to the Catholic schools that we see. And I guess if I can flip that too, I think we do a good job here at Chelsea Academy forming young souls. But I think we do have a problem in primary and secondary education across the country, even within a lot of our great Catholic schools. So I guess I'd be curious to hear from the panels, what are schools missing? Why is it that we can't form this next generation well, especially even within some professed Christian or Catholic schools?
Does this work? It does. My friend Jeremy Tate just walked in, and it made me think of talking about the classical learning test and the way in which education has had the wrong goals. Education in our country, well, Emile, you teach civics here. What do you teach in civics?
Should ask Mr. Regner, he's here as well. The Constitution, our civic republic.
And in that sense, we understand education to have a certain kind of goal for the society. And those goals should be high. What education has become in terms of the college board and what have you is a kind of ideological formation. Classical learning test sets new goals for schools to orient our children to the kind of societies that have flourished for thousands of years. And so what Jeremy Tate is doing at Classical Learning Test is setting a better goal for our students. And I think that's one of the things I see as a college professor is I can see it in the room. I can see who was formed according to what goals, even in the kinds of questions that students ask. And so being able to attend to what the goal of education is for, forming people in wisdom, forming people in understanding of the classical deposit, the goodness of that, and forming people to, well, be ordered to the city of God. There's a wonderful image, a medieval image of Augustine's city of God, which I love, which shows a medieval city, and then above the medieval city is the heavenly city. And that this is what education is for. It's for forming people who can create the kind of city that knows how to do on earth as it is in heaven. And that those are the goals we need. We need to build schools that have that kind of standard.
If I could add, and kind of be a little bit of the skunk in the room, and I'm going to be blunt because that's how I am, and I'm generalizing again, but I will say, and I've lived in Virginia my whole life, and am very sensitive to the nature of the Catholic community, especially in the northern half of the state. The Catholic community in this part of the state, and I include Christendom and Chelsea in that, of course, I would characterize as more favorably inclined toward the insular version of the Benedictine option, and dissuading people from engaging rather than hunkering down. And that is a problem for the rest of the community that would otherwise, community here is Virginia, it's America, it's the world, including China, that would benefit if we built those strong foundations with an outward focus of expanding them, because God called us to do that. And there's no place that is more important as a decision, in or out, meaning focus, in or out, than in our educational institutions. And I would offer a comparison, and Doctor, I'm definitely not trying to beat up on Christendom here. It's an excellent Catholic institution. If you compare how Christendom sort of interacts with the rest of the world to Patrick Henry over in Loudoun County, which is a somewhat evangelical equivalent, also a high quality institution. They've done very well, and they're young. And they declaratively take people in for the purpose of putting them out and seeding the world. aggressively and actively, and not in the Club Med of the Christian world, but in DC. I jokingly tell people that God put the Potomac there for a reason, and I try to respect it and stay on this side of it. But the reality is that's a joke, and if you want to change the world, you've got to get in the arena. And our education, our Catholic educational institutions should be on the forefront of generating that aggressiveness. And they are not. They are not.
That's a conservative problem as well as a Catholic problem.
It is.
You know, the Burkean little platoon can be misunderstood. You know, the Burkean little platoon can seem like the place of retreat, but there's no retreat.
What do I do? I press it once? There we go.
Yes. So it's like a debate where you named me and I get to respond. Talk about self-flattery, pretending that Burkean is mentioning me, but no.
You were one.
Yes.
Nobody got it, Tim.
The way that, well, again, to talk about Oostburg, one of the things I realized in this small Dutch town, they tried to keep out the Islamic Center of Greater Sheboygan found cheap land in Oostburg. And one of the pastors and a bunch of citizens tried to keep it out. They didn't want it. They said, this is a Christian place. And in the end, the city council debated it, thought about it, and said, of course you're allowed to come in here. We're not going to especially keep these people out. And they didn't stop because in Oostburg, you belong to a lot of different things. You belong to the church. You belong to Judy's Diner. You maybe belong to your public school, your Christian school, but also the civicness. And this is what Tocqueville goes on about. That Americans, we belong to like the silliest things, like a bowling league, and to the grandest things, to massive things like the United States of America and the Catholic Church, and to little things. And that multi-layeredness of our identity is crucial. And so to go with what Ken's saying, that's absolutely necessary, that the school has to be a little platoon, but that's also driving home, you're not just here. So my boys go to the Heights, and every once in a while you talk to a Heights senior who says, well, what I want to do is go off to University of Dallas and come back and be a Heights teacher. Now, some of my best friends followed exactly that path.
Sort of.
But if everybody there just wants to be a Heights, if everyone there just wants to be a Heights teacher, then you're not reproducing yourself.
So I've been named. Worth noting that when we started the Heights Forum, and what Chelsea's doing something similar, this was the idea of, literally the model was the Cluniac reform of education, is that we're going to set up these schools that will then resonate out a vision of what to do and have an outsized impact. So a real Benedict option understands that it's actually marching throughout all Christendom and taking it over, right? Like, you don't actually hole up, you hole up to radiate out, right? And Benedict was on the road quite a bit, actually, St. Benedict. But I think to the general question, we have a kind of educational story of folly in the 20th century, where we're fighting the current war and with the weapons of the last war, and some of those weapons are actually from our enemies, and we don't even know it because we're too ignorant to realize. The whole sort of idea of like education is to make one noble, not moral, which when I got into the education space, we were at war in Catholic, classical, and liberal arts ed, Protestant, everybody was, no, you're just teaching them reading, writing, arithmetic, you're not teaching them virtue. I'm like, well, interesting. Seneca, Cicero, Augustine, Aquinas, Alcuin, Thomas More, Erasmus, everybody worked their salt. Hawthorne, Washington, you name it, everybody said, no, you educate for virtue first, then you educate for knowledge, right? That's the order. You're gunning for virtue first, knowledge, knowing that if you shoot for virtue, you're going to get a lot of knowledge, right? But that's not the goal. And when we faced the communists in the global Cold War, everything about education was about Viva Revolucion. It was all about the party and the revolution. And as a reaction, with a pluralist and heterodox group of the peoples of Middle Earth that couldn't agree on much, we wound up saying, no. It's not for some sort of activating principle. It's just for knowledge, to try to keep out the activist, communist thing. But as a result, we threw some baby out with the bathwater in a pretty major way. And that's a huge problem that we have to get over that. And we wound up fighting them using the French Revolutionary discourse of art for art's sake. Art isn't for art's sake, study isn't for study's sake, philosophy isn't for philosophy's sake. It's for man's sake, for God's sake. Pun intended, no Lord's name in vain. Both are true, right? That's what it is, and that's what it's for. And we need to reorient, right? Even contemplation. What is contemplation? We're going to hear, assuming a masterful talk later today. Sorry, I'm not trying to gloss it too much, but what is contemplation? That is an act of man, a loving act of man. And it has to be done in right proportion. Because if you contemplate too much and you're not called to a Carthusian monastery, you're being an evil, proud person. So we actually have to have moral people. We're first and foremost working out our salvation in fear and trembling. Contemplation being a part of it. Sometimes the Benedictine discourse is, it's all contemplation. It's like, well, of course not. Of course it's the highest thing. That's our end. But it's not the means. And we have to have that double vision of balancing both ends and means, and knowing that we're actually in a means phase. And we can't forget that. And sometimes we do, and try to put heaven on earth, and then commit the follies of our communist enemies of yesteryear.
So let me throw it open to everyone in the audience here. We are running a little bit over, and I don't want to keep you from lunch for too much longer, so we'll just be able to take a couple questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I think we have one back there. Go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Cuccinelli. I don't know if you remember me. I'm Eileen Cosby. Joe Cosby is my husband. He's written for the Federalist recently because our friend Congressman Jeff Fortenberry was targeted by a weaponized DOJ. And Dr. Mehan, you talk about making sure that the young people are motivated, and not only just motivated, but well-formed. That's definitely the mission of Chelsea, where my son has attended. And we're raising him, and we moved here because of the Benedict option that you talk about. We would have stayed in Reston otherwise. So my question is, how do we deal? We just had an assassination attempt on President Trump. We're trying to engage with bravery our young daughters and sons to enter this gladiator ring with the tools that Chelsea provides, or a Catholic education provides. But at the same time, this pagan woke culture, it's very disturbing, and the persecutions are real, and I feel it personally with my friendship. But I don't know how we balance both. So that's my question.
Well, I would note with respect to the persecutions, they are real, and I've often joked about the pro-life community of which I'm a part. You know, we're too nice, and from a competitive standpoint, that's true. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing. If you're going to err one way or the other, it's probably the better way to err. But make no mistake, the other side is violent, they are disordered, and they are ill-motivated. And they will engage in behaviors beyond anything we would ever even contemplate. And they have, and they will continue to. So we are, from a sort of a worldly standpoint, we're fighting at a disadvantage from a worldly standpoint. Now, what motivates them is different than what motivates us. And we need to not only keep it in mind, but share it as best we can as we engage in these contests within our society, within all of the institutions, within the bowling league, and within the governments, many across the United States. But it's in our institutions as well, including education. And like we're not taking axes to the other side, we have to convince the other side to join us. Not, our goal isn't to defeat them, it is to convert them. And as someone who engages in very tough rhetoric under very sloppy, messy, real-world circumstances, that can be very challenging to do. And I'll give you a simple example. If you're talking about abortion in front of 100 people, you're talking to people who've had abortions. I don't even need to qualify that. So if you're having the policy debate, how do you engage in it effectively while being sensitive to those people in the room? And that is a difficult balancing act. Frankly, you can take it down to something much less personal for just people who disagree with you in the room. And disagreement is a lot easier than having that in your history, right, as part of your life timeline and what you've had to live with, and as a one of those people in the hypothetical room I'm talking about. Same is true on issues like homosexuality and gender ideology. These cut to what people perceive as who they are. And so their reactions to our advocacy for how the world should be ordered and operate, including, by advocacy I also include just our actions without words, is always going to be disproportionate. And we have to have faith that modeling the better path is part of how we prevail. Now, I was an engineer before I went to the dark side and went to law school. I'm a numbers guy too, and it doesn't hurt to have more children than they do. And as my good friend Joe Strada from many years ago said, the culture of death is self-limiting. And that is grizzly true. Grizzly? I have a bar card, I get to make up words. But the flip side is also true. The positive side is also true. And I would also note, for Chelsea, 5 of my girls went to Seton, my 2 boys go to the Summit Academy, so I've been to I've had association with all of the non-diocesan Catholic schools at the high school level. And I will say this, simple, they're all cheaper than the diocesan schools, and they're all more Catholic than the diocesan schools. And I don't think that's a coincidence, but cheap is important. I have 7 kids. Yeah, 7. And it gets hard when you get past one hand. But especially when you got a half finger going there, ruins my counts. But that really matters. It's not fair to do everything for the first kid and not the 7th kid. And we have to carry those burdens at the same time while being happier about it. There's a reason I said smiling, and I'm not kidding, it is hard for me. I'm naturally a pugilistic, I look Italian but I act Irish. I'm a very pugilistic person by nature, and I have to remember that we're selling here. We're selling. ABC always be closing, including as a Catholic, out in the public arena. And it's challenging to keep all of that together at the same time, but it's also very important. And ultimately, in the long term, I think it's very effective.
So I was named again. No, I used to take those students to England, and I did it for 6 years. My wife will correct me. This 3-credit course on Thomas More in England. And we would take them to Tyburn, where they burned, drawed, quartered, hung, disemboweled the Catholic recusant martyrs. And at the beginning, they weren't recusant, they were just Dominicans and Carthusians and just Catholics. But there's a convent there with these wonderful English nuns that pray for all of England all day. It's their whole charism for the conversion of England through the intercession of the Tyburn martyrs who were killed at Tyburn. More was killed on Tower Hill, but a lot of the others were killed at Tyburn. And this one nun, I'll never forget, she did it a few years in a row. She gave a presentation about the martyrs. And she had sort of big bug eyes like like the Igor from Young Frankenstein movie, just sort of like very comically large eyes. She'd hop from one foot to another and go, well, you realize you can't get to heaven without a martyrdom, either white or red, but you have to martyr yourself. And all these young high school kids were like, what? What is going on? But that's actually correct, and that's something you have to communicate, and that's the virtue that gloms onto that. The martyrial witness of the saints, be it red or white, in service to others, is, right, that's what the church teaches with the martyrs, but that's also the most civically regenerative thing possible, right? And if you need, regardless of what your agreement about the politics, it works on a natural level. Think of the bloody ear of Donald Trump and what it's doing to the polls and the heart. He suffered and shed blood, right? And suddenly everything changes, right? It's just the facts. And this is where justice and mercy have to kiss. People think mercy is this like otherworldly thing that's just heavenly and doesn't actually work here. No. What God wants in heaven is works on earth. Mercy is actually a more effective and more powerful moral technology for building society and converting and winning people than anything else, right? It's an update of justice, it's its perfection, than eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Because it actually reestablishes bonds, and people can do horrible things to us, and then you can say, you know what? You can still come back from this. And that is an enormous thing we have to keep open for other people. But we also have to teach them that they're coming for us. Some of us might get killed. I literally said this to my kids the other day. It was the topic of the town, right? Like, you know, if you're gonna actually serve, it's a myth of the 20th century that it's not dangerous to serve in public. Well, many people die. And that's fine. Think of Blanche, Louis IX's mother. I would rather see you dead at my feet than commit a mortal sin. That's the negative version, and that's pretty bold and magnanimous in itself. I'd part with my child rather than offend God. Well, what about I'd part with my life rather than betray trust with my fellow citizens, right? And for their conversion. Thomas More refused to take up arms when Henry was destroying everything. The Cotswolds, they rose up, they burned castles, they raised siege equipment, they charged against Henry, and More said, don't do it. Do not do it. Why? Because the fundamental engine for coming back from something so grandly egregious, which is what we're experiencing right now, the fundamental engine is actually martyrial witness in friendship, that you can kill me, and I'm not gonna go down quiet. I mean, Moore wrote 50 million books, right, at the end, right, and humiliated Henry into not going full Protestant, which is why the Church of England is actually hilariously the creation of Thomas More as a kind of mech suit of ecclesiology to bring back the Roman Church. But that's a whole other longer story, right? But it's true. You'll have to kill me, right? But I will remain in friendship. And by the way, it is precisely that mode that the Calverts and Lord Baltimore won their freedoms in the Maryland Charter, right? Which allowed Catholics a free place of worship in this country and established the model of religious liberty that has allowed this place and all of our other Catholic communities to flourish, precisely on that martyrial model of, I will serve, I will love, and you will punish me and you will do mean things to me, but I will continue in martyrial charitable witness to you. And I think we don't have enough faith and enough hope that that engine is transformative. It's a difficult road, but it is a powerful one, and it's worth bearing in mind in a time when there are a lot of foolish suggestions about how to solve the current, I think, persecutorial situation we're under.
Very briefly, because we got to get
I
lunch.
feel
But go
named.
ahead.
Can I just say one thing? That I'm haunted by a student a very faithful Catholic student who took all of these kind of insights to heart and understood that we're called to be martyrial witnesses. But he said, if I enter the public arena, they won't call me a martyr when I make a bold stance. They'll call me a bigot. So what gives me courage to go into an arena and actually not even get the honor of the martyr, but the dishonor, the shame of being called a bigot? And I'm haunted by him because that is actually an educational question. That's a faithful Catholic student who actually knows that he is called to martyrdom, but he's looking for the applause in the wrong direction. We have to look for the communion of saints applause rather than the mere praise of humans. We have to look for the praise of heaven and not for the praise of our peers.
But also, Chad, the double vision of wittily frame your sacrifice in such a way that it will have maximum benefit for converting your neighbor.
One hopes.
Well, I think that's a good point to leave it on. Now, before we do break for lunch, we will have Deacon Benyo come back up to bless the food. But first, please join me in thanking our panel.